in a certain sense, you're doing me a favor being here anyway on the makeup session. Let's see if we can't get out a little early. Okay, so we're now done with offensive WMD entirely, and we just want to talk a little bit about what technological levers you have on defense. You sort of know the main story already: bleach, 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 soap, and water. Really good about, radiological weapons, wonderful for biological weapons, good for chemical weapons. They issue a lot of bleach, and then they're more to the military, and then there's stuff that's slightly more sophisticated chemically, but it's bleach. All right, so that said, is there more to be said about the subject? Well, yes, there is. And so what I'm going to do is we'll talk about it just conventionally. Obviously, these things run into each other. There's a lot more detail in the book. I don't want you to get lost in the detail. It's probably good to have seen it once. But I'm going to try and step back from it and give you sort of 70,000-foot view. Maybe not give you all the details, but tell you the sort of salient facts, the generalizations that leap out at me. That way, when you go through the book, it makes some sense. And in particular, for this detectors part of the talk, so what kinds of detectors do we need? What tasks do we want detectors to take care of? And then, because we're going to have an R&D section later in the course, so what are the hot things one could build? And, are we sure they could be built? And how would you go about procuring them, right? If you were the government, it's great to talk about, oh, well, there's this silver bullet technology, right? I don't want to say anything that's politically suspect. I'm equal opportunity. I insult everyone. But, if you have some limited budget at the Department of Homeland Security, you probably don't want to invest in cylindrical. And what do you do, right, to make sure that you get actual technologies instead of, gee, I picked these things and things don't turn out sometimes, right? I mean, that's going to be true. Whatever system you have, there are going to be dry holes. But how do you know that you're giving out the money to people who are really sincerely working hard and who have information that genuinely tells them, right, that this is a hot technological prospect, and aren't just saying that because they want to live on the grant money? So we're going to introduce sort of stereotypical tasks that if you could improve existing detector technology later, if you could improve existing treatments, medical technologies, that, gee, I would like that, and people say that it can be done. And part of that is just to give you the technological landscape, but part of it is that we're going to come back to the idea about how do you manage innovation, right? Everybody I meet in Washington tells me that they know how to manage innovation. This is plainly false. How do you think carefully, other than I have this touch, right? All human beings believe in anything we do, I have the touch. That's, I can't explain to you why I have the touch. I can't explain to you how you can have the touch. I have the touch. This is magical reasoning, very unlikely. I mean, some people may. But how do you think in an analytical way about, well, I have this particular technology, how do I go about designing for it? So later in the course, we're going to talk about that, because as you can see tonight, a large part of this subject is, gee, we really do need new technologies. I can talk dismissively about silver bullets all I want, but that's clearly some of the long policy levers that you have available here. But if that's true, right, how do you go about eliciting people to do that? And, heavy hint, right, the guy who comes up to you and he says, I have this great technology, right, and the thing is that if we could do this, it would cure cancer also. So you really want to have this for your Homeland Security budget, and we should have some instinct, right, that, let me get this straight. There's this enormous venture capital market, and you're coming to me with this technology that would cure cancer, but it will solve my Homeland Security problem, and you want me to fund it, but the market hasn't done that already, right? So there's an interesting issue here, right, where everybody who comes to you know much more about their technology than you do. Who do you believe? How do you set things up so that they put honest effort into chasing stuff? And it turns out that this is a really subtle discussion. So they teach, there's a whole branch of economics called mechanism design. This is a really deep subject, but I'm going to give you a flavor of it later in the course. And the setup tonight is to at least notice some technologies that are real technologies So that instead of saying, you know, I make up some drug that would be really handy, and then we talk about it, well, we apply these ideas to things that are actually real. So I'm going to show you some of the things that, you know, people in the national labs would like to chase, and then later in the course we could talk about, well, how would you set up incentives for this, right? Because you could set up better and worse incentives. My favorite poster child of this is that Congress in 2002, 2003 set up something called Project BioShield. They appropriated $5.6 billion to reward drug research, and they came up with basically nothing. And we'll talk about this, but the point is that they're insanely badly designed incentives, and anybody who studies mechanism design across the street would have told them that. In fact, the drug companies would have told them that because they know this even in the commercial world. Very bad incentive design. How can you do this in a more subtle, more organized way? And to give you a sense that there's complexity in this, that it's not trivial, the point is that there isn't one solution for everything. You really have to choose your incentive mechanisms in light of what you believe the inventive problem is. And the inventive problem will differ from problem to problem. So tonight I'm going to show you a couple of inventive problems that you'd like to solve that plausibly would do a lot of good in Homeland Security world if we had these silver bullets, but, right, we don't exactly know if this is possible, or if people want grants and are lying to us, or, you know, what mechanism would actually make them work hard as opposed to go to the beach. So we want to think about those things, but tonight at least I'll point out that which should be obvious, but I'm going to document for you that there are like technologies that you would really like to have in Homeland Security world. And we'll come back to that later as we get deeper into policy. All right. So detectors. Basically, big surprise, the detector story depends on what kind of WMD, obviously. So we just break this out slide by slide. And something in me rebels at the usual lab usage, rad nuke, but if you want to be, you know, sound like one of the boys, over at the lab they call this rad nuke, anything that's radioactive. And why is there a distinction between rad and nuke? This is review, somebody tell me. Tell me, you know, that lazy indolence of the policy expert. It's really beneath you to answer this, but you know, you'll sort of drawl an answer at me for asking this stupid. What's the difference between rad and nuke? So what's a nuclear material? It's not a material that has a nucleus, all matter has that. What do they mean when they say nuclear materials? Come on, this is one if you slept through the class and woke up in the midterm, you got a 50% shot. Take it again.
Unstable.
And specifically, it has this quality that it supports chain reactions. So 1 neutron in, 2 neutrons out, exponential growth, here we go again. Hey, that's great, that's twice we've taught exponential equations in this class. All right. So, notice, by the way, right? The number of new nuclei that become unstable is a function of the number of nuclei that just became unstable in the preceding generation. Definition of exponential growth, right? The rate is proportional to the number that are unstable right now. Okay. So, rad nuke is the stuff that will support actual nuclear weapons, i.e. plutonium and uranium. Radiation, well, if you're just interested in spreading curies over the landscape, radiation is all sorts of stuff, okay? And plus, there's background. One of the great melancholy facts that you can learn in this course is that there's lots of backgrounds, and we made some of them. So it turns out that one of the problems we have is that bananas are intensely radioactive at the level of things you would expect to find inside a cargo container that are dangerous, right? Once people get around to shielding the radioactive material, bananas turn out to be, you know, a good source of radioactivity. Anybody got a guess? This is generational. I don't think you're going to know this. But anybody got a guess about how bananas came to be radioactive? So bananas have lots and lots of potassium. That's why sprinters like it. And we made a lot of potassium, radioactive potassium in the 1950s doing what? Testing H-bombs in the atmosphere. So for the next century or so, right, we're going to have lots of radioactive bananas. Leather is radioactive too. So what you're going to have is you have sort of 3 problems within rad nuke. If you're looking for nuclear materials, you can make detectors that are very, very focused on just a couple of materials, uranium and plutonium. Comparatively easy, we'll talk about it. If you want all radiological materials, it's harder because all these things look very different from one another. And then, you have to exclude background stuff like bananas. So you want to have something that reliably finds everything and spits out a lot of curies, but you want to be able to detect bananas and confirm they're bananas and not bother to look anymore. It becomes difficult because half the periodic table is radioactive at this level, right? And there are a lot of different things to discriminate against. It's a harder problem if you're just looking for nuclear weapons. If you think about this from a policy standpoint, what does this tell you? Well, the thing you're really, really, really afraid of is nuclear weapons, if there is one, but you're overwhelmingly more likely to be hit by a radiological weapon because they're not that difficult to make in the scheme of things compared to nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons were easy to make, the Iranians would have them. So you have an interesting investment problem here that the hard detectors are more useful in the sense that you expect to have radiological threats. If you really believe there were atomic bombs floating around, we'll see in a minute, that's still fairly difficult, but much simpler than trying to build some general purpose thing that finds all radiological stuff against a background of natural radioactivity that you don't want to unpack the shipping container each time, right, and see the confirm by hand that it really is bananas. That's a problem at the port overload. Okay, so the good news here is that we have 100 years of physicists doing laboratory stuff with radioactivity, and so there's a very mature technology. It's also a very direct technology in the way that, one high energy particle comes in and it spits out an electrical signal, or at least a photon. So it's very direct, and that makes the measurements kind of easy. But all of this technology was built for a lab environment where you have lots of lab technicians and money is no object because you're not deploying this all across the universe. And so you need to invent things that take this technology and make it cheap and affordable and robust in the hands of idiots. Okay. So what would you want to do with this? Well, you would want to find this stuff before it blows up. That's sort of important for nuclear materials. And what is that? Well, you would want to look at shipping containers as they come in, cars and trucks as they go across the border, detectors outside the nuclear weapons plant to make sure people don't take stuff home with them, and then so-called ubiquitous detectors. If somebody's wandering around Manhattan with a truck full of radiological material, you would like the police car to notice this before it detonates. So those are the basic kinds of things that happens. Could you do this is this sort of thing reasonable to do for chemical weapons or biological weapons? What's special? Or is it just something that is possible to believe that this would work for radiological and nuclear materials, but not other stuff? Is it reasonable to try and find is it reasonable to try and detect chemical or biological weapons before they go off? Why is it reasonable to try and detect rad-nuc materials before they go off? So we talked about this. Rad-nuc materials give off gamma rays, and the neat thing about gamma rays is, so they go forever, right? 150 meters in the open air. It's hard to shield this stuff. And if you do shield it, you end up with, inside a container, you end up with these strange configurations. So, you can look simultaneously at you can X-ray the thing to see if it's surrounded by lead, and if it's not surrounded by lead and your nuclear detector doesn't sense anything, then you begin to have some idea that probably it hasn't been shielded, right? Because of gamma rays and their penetrating power, you have some chance, right, of detecting rad-nuc materials. You don't, if I have a test tube full of a biological agent, it's real simple. I dip the test tube, I seal the test tube, I dip the test tube in bleach. Presto, no biological agent, totally clean, I can walk around with it forever. right? Nobody's going to detect this. It doesn't give off some particle, right, that can be seen 150 meters away. So that's what's different about Rad Nuke. What other things would you like? Well, if one of these things goes off, a dirty bomb, you would like to have devices that you could carry with you into an area to see if it's safe to be standing there. And eventually, you would like to have devices that, you can go into an area to see if there's even low levels of background so that you can map the area and see if it's safe to come back in and inhabit it. So that's sort of your wish list. And what would you, let's see if I have more about this. No. So those things vary, right, on how well defined the environment is and how much time I have. And so you get various ways to take this lab technology and adapt it to these defined problems which were never faced in the lab. And so what you're doing is you're bolting on new extensions to this very robust basic technology, and you're trying to do it cheaper or solve specialized problems where the problem is very controlled. So if you're trying to see what's in a cargo container, you can have the truck roll across a scale, so now there's a constraint on how much lead is in there. You can X-ray it, and at the same time, you can bang it with neutrons, and neutrons create chain reactions, right? So if you're looking for nuclear materials, you bang it with neutrons, and there should be neutrons coming out. You can put stuff, paraffin around the thing to block the neutrons, but then you would see it in the X-ray, and you have various constraints on the problem. And what turns out, if you push the physicists, is it doesn't matter how many different constraints on the problem there is, you can probably design something that will fool it, but if people are a little uncertain about exactly how your system is designed, you'll catch them statistically, at least with great regularity. So if you are looking for a very narrow specific thing and you have various simultaneous measurements that you can make, you can build credible detectors. You can guess the standard joke, right? So active interrogation is this idea that you bang the thing with neutrons to see if there's nuclear material or fissile material inside. What's the standard joke, guys, about what will happen when you bang it with neutrons? Okay, so you have this fissionable material, and we know how atomic bombs work now, right? I mean, you bang it with neutrons and you get a chain reaction. It's a little alarming, right? You're going to maybe set it off. Probably not, but people mention it, right? Okay, so what would you like to build? Well, it turns out that a lot of the detector materials that physicists use, because they don't use them in huge quantities, are really expensive, and so there's a lot of effort to find better materials that would give you more accuracy about exactly what is the energy of this gamma ray coming off, because if you want to tell the difference between different radiological materials, you need to measure that. You would like to do imaging. The problem with gamma rays is they penetrate everything, so how do you make a lens? It turns out that you make these masks that are basically like manhole covers with holes in them, and then one mask in front of the other in front of the detector, and you can back out from the pattern of how this stuff gets through the holes what the scene it's viewing in the world. Why would you do that? Because the detector is really, really a lot more sensitive if it knows that it's staring at something. You don't want a detector that just sort of sees the whole world. You want it to focus on particular areas. So if you could do this, that would be great. NASA does this for cosmology satellites, but just saying that says this is a pretty specialized technology, and you want to do something that's going to do that cheaply. And then finally, there's this idea of active interrogation, and what that basically is that fissile materials, if you bang them, will fission, and those materials will decay after a predictable interval, and those materials will decay all the way down into various daughter products. And so if you bang them at time 0, you expect a certain flux of certain kinds of gamma rays at time t equals 10 seconds, and a different population at t equals 20 seconds, and they have these distinctive signatures if you're looking for a specific material. So you can find nuclear materials really well that way, but then you don't have a general radiation detector. So you're not getting the benefit of stopping radiological weapons, maybe if you fear atomic bombs a lot, you can cost it out, so you should build these things. People look puzzled. Questions? Okay. So chemical detectors is something, again, that, chemists have been doing for hundreds of years. And, how do you detect chemicals in the lab? Well, you take their spectra, you shine a laser on them and see how the light gets absorbed. Or you do what's called mass spectrometry. You put a charged particle on one of these molecules that you're trying to measure, and then you move it through a magnetic field, and you see how much it bends in the magnetic field when you rush it past the magnetic field. And that's how you figure out what a chemical is in the lab. And the question is, how do you do this without a lot of expensive equipment and grad students? So you probably can't detect chemical weapons before an attack. So you don't have that category of problem. But you would like to have, after the stuff is in the environment, something that warns the first responders. In chemical weapons attacks, also in radiological attacks, you have victims who are intensely hot, right? They're poisonously radioactive to others, usually vomiting up, right? Stuff you don't want to be in contact with for more than the usual reasons. First responders are in trouble from that. You want to find out if the people you're dealing with, right, are actually a current health threat. That means you need something fairly portable. And beyond that, you want to be able to test the environment in general, right, to see if this area is something that you should be walking around in. Eventually, you're going to want to map whole neighborhoods and make sure that every little corner is clean, and that's problematic, right, with chemical weapons, which can end up down in the soil, so that a couple of years later, if somebody digs a hole, the stuff starts leaching up into the air again. Happened on the Western Front in the First World War, right? Every time there's a shell hole, you end up with chemical weapons that were deposited several years ago, and they start reaching people again. So it's a challenge, right, to survey an entire neighborhood and say, yep, all clear, none of this stuff is around. And then finally, I won't say much about it this time, but you want to find out where this stuff came from, and this is the study of impurities in the chemical weapon. Okay. So what would you like here? Again, you have a technology that works great in the lab, and the question is, can you make it portable, and can you make it more accurate? Because you don't want false positives, right? If you're not going to build any civilian warning system that goes off at random once or twice a year, right? You're not going to evacuate the mall every time that happens, at least not in our world. So what do? Can you leave this stuff alone for long periods, happily taking measurements? And a lot of the effort at the labs, things you'll see referenced in the book, are about efforts to build these autonomous systems. And then the real technological frontier, right? I've told you about things that are basic lab technologies are, hundreds of years old. Biodetectors are very recent, and more importantly, more importantly, the technologies that work in the lab involve taking a wipe on one sample and transferring it to another. A lot of the problem of automating this stuff is simply all those lab technician skills, nobody's figured out how to implement them mechanically. You would think that that's not the hardest part of it, but they're not in this convenient way. In a nuclear detector, when a gamma ray hits your scintillator, it releases light, and you can pick that up real easily. Here, you have to get a sample through an air filter, and then you have to take solvent and get stuff out of the air filter, and then you have to get it next to a little cell on a chip that has antigens that will bind to the thing that you're looking for, and then you have to fluoresce the cell on the chip to see if the antigens have bound to anything, and there are a lot of labor steps and a lot of skill, and normally this takes expensive technicians, and can you make something like this that cheerfully does this in the world? Well, that's been a really big problem. So, question, right? If you're thinking about doing technology, do you make a judgment that, gosh, nobody's going to solve all these little steps? Or do you ask your experts who are going to say, hey, yeah, that can be done? Or do you try and set up some incentive system so that people who genuinely know that it can be done or believe it can be done self-select and go take a shot at it, right? There's a really difficult innovation problem here. You sitting in Washington can tell all the stories you want with great assurance that, well, it's an incredibly complicated thing, they'll never build that. Or, well, they can build that, it's just like making little wheels move, how hard could that be, right? You're actually not the person with that information, right? This is the typical social science way of looking at this. How do I get people who actually have the information to self-select, if and only if they have reason to believe that the problem is solvable? So we'll come back to that, but that's the central challenge here, right, is that A, these are new technologies, so we don't have everything that we would probably have with another 10 years of the subject. But B, making this stuff autonomous, right? If we could do that, we'd solve healthcare, right? All these expensive diagnostic procedures, wouldn't it be great if you could just get all the lab techs out of that business? We would want to do that on more general grounds, and when you hear me say we would want to do that on more general grounds, we should all in unison say, so how come it's not already true, right? If the market hasn't done this thing, why? You guys in Washington are the first people to wake up in the middle of the night and say, gee, wouldn't that be great if we had that? Probably you're not that much smarter than the market. Maybe there's a really profound reason why it can't be done. So, those kind of issues are here. All right, so you're not going to detect this stuff before the attack. You would like to know when an attack has occurred, right? And remember, with biological weapons, there's this long interval between when people are exposed and when they start falling dead. And there's a longer interval, right, when you can still intervene before most of them die. And so you would like to have that kind of warning, and so you have these pathogen surveillance systems. The one at the lab is called BASIS. It's the one that was deployed at the Salt Lake City Olympics. I guess Mitt Romney's proud of that. Nobody died of biological weapons on his watch. Told you I was even-handed. So you want to look for that. And what those things are is what you would expect. They're a big air filter system, and some tech comes around every 24 hours and puts them in the back of his Volkswagen and drives them to the lab in Livermore, and a bunch of expensive lab instruments look at it, and 24, 36 hours later they find out if there was an attack, and then they repeat the cycle. And so, it's not ideal, but you can do that in our world. And there's some number in the book, there's a persistent rumor number, but there are a dozen or 24 American cities that apparently have this set up. But you would like to do a lot better. You would like these things to live by themselves and then pick up the phone and call you if they think they've just seen a biological weapon. Let's do this in real time. Why should the speed be governed by how fast a Volkswagen can go between Washington and wherever the nearest lab is? That doesn't seem right. Then you would like even handier things, right, that a first responder could have when he's in an area where there's anthrax. Gee, I understand how you can see if there's something nuclear, the Geiger counter goes off basically. But it seems difficult, right, that you have something in real time which samples the air in a little box like this and then turns red, right, if he's in the presence of something nasty. The bigger problem is for the whole environment, not just to protect the first responder, but you would like things that allow you to walk around in the environment and see what's clean and what isn't. And finally, you're going to want to look at consequence management again, this checking the whole environment to see when it's safe to move back in. You're doing this on a retail business, and how do you know, right, that there isn't some anthrax a little to the left of where you sampled? So this, of all the detector technologies, right, it's hard to make this stuff autonomous, and you don't, and you have big challenges. What could you do about it? Well, the answer is, unlike radiation and nuclear stuff, this is a technology that's still growing. So you can piggyback on the market to some extent, and the market development in the last 10 years is there's this wonderful marriage, right, of silicon chip technology and biology. And you know how a silicon logic chip inside your computer, right, people paint on different lines, one on the other, and one line's conductive and one's a semiconductor, and soon you have this elaborate little machinery of transistors and resistors and all that good stuff put down by lithography on a chip, right? This is why the technology works like thunder. It's like printing books. You're not making a machine, you're just printing stuff. So that's where the whole Moore's Law computer revolution comes from. Now you could do something similar to that. Instead of painting down various kinds of material to change the electrical conductivity, you can cut little wells in the chip and you can cut little plumbing to each of the wells, and you can put in each of the wells a different antigen, a biological material that recognizes one and only one thing in the environment. So, you know, if you look carefully at smallpox and you decide that any smallpox I see in the world is going to have the following 7 proteins on it, that's my diagnostic, that's my signature. You can put those 7 proteins in different wells, and you can then take your sample once you've dissolved it and run it through this plumbing to each of the 7 wells, and then you can shine a light on each of the wells, and if they've bound to something, they'll light up luminously, right? And so this is something that you had to do with a beaker full of test tubes in the old days, but now you can put a lot of this capability on a chip. And that is working, but these chips are still something that are, you know, basically a lab toy. You still need a lot of care and feeding. And ultimately, right, you'd like to have the whole step done out in the field by the machinery itself. The nice thing is, at least to the extent these things are in labs, well, gee, if I have a chip with 1,000 wells, and most of these things are looking for stuff that doctors care about, you know, you're doing blood specimens, for instance. What's this guy sick of? You know, is it influenza? Is it something else? You've made a lot of this already. What's it going to cost at the margin for Homeland Security to have 6 more wells to see if he's suffering from a bioweapon instead? Right? You have the opportunity to get in on this mass-produced market thing and add a little capability at the margins for bioweapons detectors. So, you know, you have that possibility. Turns out really interesting, right? This is a little bit of stray policy knowledge, but I have to tell you I'm a science database guy, and I'm just passionate, so you have to put up with it. What's the thing that you would really, really like to build this thing? What's the information that you need? Well, you need a lot of grubby information about which surface coats are related to which pathogens that have been seen in the wild. So, you know, on my piece of anthrax, these 6 proteins show up, but maybe this is the only piece of anthrax in the world that has these 6 proteins. What I really want is the 6 proteins that show up on every anthrax that ever has been seen. And so you'd like a database of all the anthrax codes, and they're all in the literature somewhere, but you'll never find them, right? You would want a database that actually shows you, you know, which things you should make your target, because apparently the organism can't live without them. And it turns out that NSF hates funding database projects. Anywhere you go in science, in biology, in physics, anywhere else, the guy who does the community-wide database is sort of some hated curmudgeon who lives off by himself and gets almost no money, because that's not real science, right? Real science is doing new experiments. So this is sort of perpetually underfunded. But if you were really like, cared about building better detectors, the long pole in that tent, there are people at the lab who beg government every year, please do a database of the things that would be signatures for bioweapons. Don't spend money on detector technology. You need to know what the signatures are. And that stuff year after year is never collected because it's not glamorous. So, you know, that would be something that you'd want to do. Let the civilians spend the money building these elaborate chip detectors, and then you can rent a few more wells to do that test piggyback on the usual diagnostic effort. But what are those wells looking for? Well, that would be, you know, you have some idea what you would like to do is actually build this database so you had a better understanding of the threats. And we actually will talk a little bit about that issue because it comes up in the synthetic biology context. Okay, so you can do this lab on a chip thing. The thing you'd really like to do is there are apparently 2 ways to figure out what the organism is if you have one of these lab on a chip guys. And one is you look at the DNA, but the problem with that is that the DNA is inside the organism, so first you have to kill it. And what you would like to do is look at the proteins on the outside of the organism, because in all these environments, right, you're going to have a lot of dead organisms, and that's not so alarming, but you'd like to know the live ones. And in particular, when you get a hit that says that, oh, I've detected a threat organism, you'd like to grow a lot of it to confirm the hit. And the big limit on these detectors is that right now it's a lot easier to detect DNA, and you would like to have a 1,000-time better ability to detect proteins, because then you can actually deal with or find out whether the organism is alive or dead, which makes a big deal. And then there's sort of an odd thing, just to remind you that it isn't all about biotechnology. People claim that, you know, what's the biggest detector of all? Well, it's all these people walking around getting sick. And maybe if you understood what people are complaining about to doctors this week, you would be much better placed to judge an attack. So far this hasn't panned out. What happens is that, garbage in and garbage out, people have had trouble finding, separating signal from the noise. All right. So, just before we move off of this, you can see in a general way in each of these fields how you could improve the technology and what people will basically put in grant requests for. But the question is, do you want to invest in these things, right? Not everything you can do is worth doing, or rather with limited dollars, there are other things you would like to do first. And the sort of run-of-the-mind thing to bring up, right, is that, well, gee, at some point this isn't worth the candle, the threat isn't that big to begin with, so this is this problem about how do you do cost-benefit, and since you have no idea what the threat is, that's a little difficult, although presumably it differs from subject to subject. But I want to point that there are deeper problems. One that I've talked about today, right, is that, well, you build the better detectors, but maybe you want to invest in other things, non-proliferation. And more importantly, and I guess I've said this, but what you want to worry about is there's always going to be somebody saying, give me money and I'll deliver this technology, and how do you sift out the people who are just trying to make a career out of that, and those who really are, just telling you the flat truth. I have never met a biologist, I think this is true, I've never met a single biologist who didn't have some excellent technology that was going to save the Earth. And I know statistically that can't be true, that all of them were telling me the truth, or I'm just lucky I meet cool people. They are cool people, right? But every last one of them doesn't tell me, like, it's like Lake Wobegon. All the children are way above average. And so how do I sort that out if I'm DHX? Friend of a friend who's really, vouched for? How do you sort those people out so that you get technologies that are really going to go somewhere? And one heavy hint, right, that I've given you is if the market should reward this already, how come it's not there? I mean, that's something you should definitely worry about in these fields where people say,